I'm James Gibney, an editor at Bloomberg Opinion, and I'm here today with Liam Denning, an energy columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, and Mark Gongloff, who covers climate change for us. We've all had, I think, the hottest day on record, and we're still clearing our lungs out, clearing the Canadian wood smoke from out of our lungs. But we're here today to talk about the case for tapping Alaska's hydrocarbons. Liam Denning has written a great article called Drilling for Oil on the Moon, which you can find on Bloomberg Opinion's website. I guess, Liam, I'd start by asking why, given all that's happening in the world, it makes sense to even consider tapping Alaska's oil resources. As you know, Joe Biden recently approved the Willow project, which is an oil development on the North Slope. Why does it make sense to do that now?
Thanks, James. So I think there's a couple of big picture things to think about. One is that even as we transition from a hydrocarbons-based economy to a post-carbon economy, in the meantime, we're still using a lot of oil and gas. We're still, in fact, close to a record amount of oil demand in the world. So that's point one. So as long as we're using a lot of it, we need to make sure there's adequate supply of it. The second really boils down to something which is kind of a long-running theme through Alaska's whole oil and gas development going back to the 1970s, and that's geopolitics. Obviously, Russia invaded Ukraine last year. There's been a renewed focus on energy security, given Russia's identity as a major oil exporter, and I think it's a pretty safe bet that the Biden administration's approval of the Willow project on the North Slope earlier this year may not have gone that way if we didn't have that geopolitical backdrop. So I would say it's the fact that we use a lot of oil still, and we will continue to do so for the foreseeable future, and then the question of energy security coming to the fore.
You know, I'm a little surprised you didn't mention something that had figured quite prominently in your article just now as a reason for doing it, and that is Alaska's dependence, the dependence of Alaska's economy, the dependence of its tax base on hydrocarbon revenues.
Yeah, indeed, that is a third leg of the stool here. Alaska as a whole, the oil and gas extraction is about a fifth of the economy, which actually understates its importance because roughly half of government state revenues derive in one way or another from the oil sector. And those numbers get even more extreme when you actually move to the North Slope borough, which is the area around where most of the oil production takes place. It's fairly sparsely populated. It's about year-round population of about 10 or 11,000, and it's mostly Inupiat communities that are there. They depend overwhelmingly on taxes from oil production to fund their government. Something like 90% of local revenues, which fund all sorts of local services and which also fund the biggest employer in the region. So, you know, we often kind of wring our hands about how to transition, say, mining communities in Appalachia to a post-carbon economy, but in some ways that what's happening on the North Slope makes that look easy by comparison.
You know, Mark, you did a column recently talking about why panic about climate change is generally unproductive, but you also said, hey, maybe now we're, at a point where a little panic might not be a bad thing. So did you panic when you read Liam's article, even though he's a colleague and a friend?
I did, but his great writing assuaged my panic quickly. It is a great column, and I encourage everybody to read it. I didn't feel any panic, but I felt a little bit of cognitive dissonance because, as you pointed out at the start of this, James, we are smashing global climate records left and right. Arctic Antarctic sea ice is at a record low for this time of year. We've just had the record high, the hottest day, week, month, and probably coming up soon year in human history, recorded human history anyway. And so it feels like you really could make the argument that we've got to stop burning fossil fuels as quickly as possible in order to have any hope of limiting warming to like 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial averages. We've already gotten 1.2 degrees Celsius, and the climate is already kind of going haywire. But Liam does make so yes, there is a little bit of cognitive dissonance in reading about this, and I get the energy security arguments and if we're going to be using oil, we might as well use our oil, American oil. But there's also this little voice yelling in the back of my head, hey, we got to stop using oil altogether. Liam does make the argument, and I know Liam, understands all this too. He's been writing about this longer than I have. And he does make a very good point in the piece about how this could, in some weird kind of jujitsu way, help the energy transition if we're pumping oil. And I wonder, Liam, if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. So what that really boils down to is talking about the main commodity that we need to have a great supply of when it comes to energy transition. I think especially in the United States at this moment, and that's political capital. In very broad terms, the energy transition is really a demand-led thing. It's about changing our own embedded incentives and behaviors. From obvious things like, swapping our gas guzzlers for EVs, changing over to renewable power sources and that sort of thing. But it is a fraught political project, particularly in the US, just because it's taken on some of these tribal characteristics of the culture war. I guess my reasoning with regards to Alaskan oil, it boils down to a couple of things. One is there is this narrative out there that as the Arctic melts under the pressure of climate change, that it will kick off some kind of scramble for resources there, that we're about to see the estimated 400 billion barrels of oil and gas equivalent that's thought to be up there will suddenly be tapped. I'm very skeptical of that, simply because this is not cheap or easy oil and gas to get at. The only or the driving reason we did it in the first place in the 1970s, it was really a political calculation. It was the need to offset the disruption of the Arab oil embargo that forced through the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in the first place. But I think the second thing is around maintaining support for energy transition as a whole. And again, I would go back to what happened last year in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. We saw, at least in nominal terms, the highest pump prices that's ever been seen in the US. They averaged just over $5 a gallon in the summer of 22, and we did see a notable pivot from the administration at that point. And I should stress the DNA of the Biden administration remains very green. That is clearly where the emphasis of their energy and, to a large degree, their economic and industrial policy lies. But we did see Biden tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to try and address that. We did see, at least rhetorically, a shift from Biden and Energy Secretary Granholm towards the oil industry, offering an olive branch of sorts, asking them to produce more to offset the power of Russia in the oil market. And then, as I said earlier, we did see the decision to approve the Willow project earlier this year. And I think what that speaks to is they know that in order to maintain political momentum behind the energy transition in the US, people need to not lapse back into this sense of energy scarcity, which I think is a long-running theme through U.S. politics in general since the 1970s. What we generally find, I think, is that when people panic about their energy security or the price they're paying for their energy, there is a tendency to revert back to just getting energy in any form we can. And so if domestic oil production to some degree helps to offset that, I think in a weird way it kind of helps the project.
Just to amplify your point a bit, I did look recently at some of Pew's polling organizations' data on public concern about climate change. And in January of this year, they did a poll that showed that 37% of Americans thought climate change should be a top priority for the U.S. government. Now that's versus 75% of Americans who thought fixing the 60% thought that reducing healthcare costs should be a priority. All told, it ranked about 17th out of 21 issues in terms of, strength of feeling about this being a top priority. So clearly, it's at the public level of public perception, it doesn't seem to be rising to that. The other thing that struck me about what you say is that, you said nominal prices were at the highest. But of course, as you know far better than I, in terms of constant dollars, and in terms of percentage of household income, gas prices were, much lower than their peaks, I think. It's just interesting that public opinion is such a hard thing to satisfy, a hard thing to steer by, because the underlying facts don't necessarily square with the perceptions.
Yeah, I think just on that, I think part of the issue here is if you go back to when Biden was campaigning, obviously due to the experience of the COVID pandemic, the share of the U.S. wallet that was going on energy had plunged to very low levels, and indeed that may be one reason why he felt able to lean into the green agenda when he was campaigning. And even with the rebound last year, as you say, we were nowhere near the percentage of income being taken by energy that we had seen in previous, so-called energy crises, such as, back in 2008 when oil hit its peak price. But I think, there's two things you shouldn't discount. One is just the whiplash effect. Sometimes it's not the absolute level of prices, it's just the rate of change that spooks people. And two, gasoline is just that price that, every day in a way that they don't see with other things. You're driving along and you just see it being blared at you every couple of miles from the side of the road. So I think there's a psychology aspect here that can't be overlooked.
Mark, speaking of psychology, we've just, as you pointed out, and others have pointed out, and as we've all experienced, a couple of really hard hammer blows, a combination of extreme heat, people up and down the eastern seaboard feeling the effects of Canadian forest fires. Do you feel from your work that you're seeing a significant shift in public opinion?
I think it's a little too early to say, just given how much we see, given how much has happened this year. It's a little too early to say how much what's happened this year has affected that. I have hope that it will. What I think we have seen, though, as you point out, that Pew poll showed about 2/3 of the country is very worried about climate change, and that is consistent across other polls and even within states. So if you go to Texas, which is a pretty red state, or Florida, same kind of percentages there. 67% believe in climate change, worry about it, fear for the future of it. But they're being hit all the time, not just this year, but in past. Obviously, Florida is the entire state's a flood zone. They're hit by hurricanes. They're seeing rising sea levels. They're seeing algae blooms and all kinds of horrible things. So they're concerned about it. But then there's also, again, speaking of cognitive dissonance, they also care just a little bit more about in the immediate future about the economy and stuff like that. And so I haven't yet. I'm not sure yet. We've gotten to the point where people are willing to accept a lot of economic pain that would match their level of concern about the climate. And so, one of the things is one of the problems that faces, like, say, Joe Biden is, in order to continue the transition, you kind of have to keep people in office who are interested in the transition. And if people start to panic, they may worry about the climate, but if they can't pay the bills and they can't, buy groceries or gas, they have this throw the bums out mentality, and then the next regime of leaders will maybe be less interested in the climate transition. So it's a knife edge that all these politicians have to walk. And I certainly haven't seen public opinion yet get to the point where we're ready to, make huge sacrifices to concern.
One of the things that struck me about the Willow Project, which you talk about a little bit, Liam, is in general the long time frame it takes to develop offshore and onshore. And given the time lag, the 30 years or 15 years or 20 years, that's when we're supposed to be hitting our net zero targets. Why go for such a long-term project when there are, sources of oil that are easier to access, quicker to access? That struck me as kind of a head scratcher.
I think it's partly an issue of, although this is an industry that kind of has a reputation of wildcatters, you tend to drill the most profitable drill. So I think with Willow in particular, the way to think about that is this is a project where, you're 8 miles from existing infrastructure. It will effectively leverage a lot of existing infrastructure that's been built on the North Slope, since the 1970s. So for a company like Conoco, as they're choosing, whether to put money into their shale resources in Texas or their international assets or Alaska, they look at Alaska and they say, yeah, it's not the cheap 800 miles in a pipeline. You have to put it in, Jones Act compliant tankers that are owned by the company. But even after all that, it's high quality crude oil. It gets international pricing, and because they've already spent a lot on the infrastructure there, they'll actually make a decent kind of free cash flow margin from it. Now, having said that, I think the flip side of that is because the North Slope is so remote, and because it takes quite a lot to actually operate there. This is why I don't think we're going to see, some kind of free-for-all drilling in the Arctic. Even Willow, which was, discovered in 2016, it's not going to be producing oil probably till about 2029. In order for that, to be honest, it's not even the biggest project. The reserves are 600 million barrels. It doesn't even make the top 10 of the biggest Arctic projects that are out there. In order to operate there, you have to be a big company, and you really have to be an incumbent for it to make sense. So, one way to think about this is Alaska at its peak in the 1980s was producing more than 2 million barrels a day. Right now, it's down to about 450,000 barrels. With Willow, that will take it up some, but because of natural decline at other fields, you're still talking about fairly modest growth out of the North Slope. So, it's not going to be a repeat of what we saw in the 1970s and 1980s, even if you lifted the various, barriers to legislative or political barriers to developing that.
So I happen to have the disadvantage of being in Washington, which is probably ground zero for cynicism in this country. Although, I'm sure there are other places that give it a run for its money. Given what you just said about the time frame for Willow, it's not going to do anything immediately to change the energy picture in the U.S. I mean, just what was he thinking? I mean, it seems like mostly a political gesture. If if you're trying to, address energy scarcity, so this really doesn't do anything to address energy scarcity in his lifetime. We know he's going to live to be 120 and be our president for, at least one more term. But
Well, despite your cynicism, I think you may be onto something. Yeah.
well,
I
that's
think.
good.
I think there's a couple of things. One is with oil and gas development. To a certain degree, there's always lags in terms of, when a project gets approved before, you actually see first production. The Arctic is on the extreme end of that. And some projects, as you mentioned, if you were to actually do a greenfield offshore project there, it wouldn't be developed. It might not actually produce oil until the 2050s, which is, again, another reason I'm very skeptical that we're going to see a lot of offshore development in the U.S. Arctic. But to come back to Biden, look, I think in very simple political terms, it would have been very difficult for him to, release 180 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to deal with an energy security emergency, and one which, let's face it, is likely to last for quite a while, regardless of what happens with the Ukraine war itself. There's been a fundamental breach in the energy relationship between Russia and the West, and that's gonna have repercussions for a while. But I think the other thing to bear in mind is, Congresswoman Mary Peltola, the Democratic congressional representative of Alaska, who also happens to be a native Alaskan, she was behind this project in part because of what it would mean in terms of economic security for the Inupiat communities up on the North Slope. And I think that gave Biden a certain measure of cover to do this. And again, I think if he had blocked this project, it probably would have gone to, a big legal battle, given Conoco's existing licenses and that sort of thing. So I think politics did play a large part.
Mark, what Liam was just saying about economic dependence makes me wonder. I mean, it's quite staggering when you look at the tax base and that Alaska has and its degree of reliance on hydrocarbons. You spend a lot of time looking at how we can affect a transition to net zero. Are there any models of countries or states that are tackling this problem? How do you shift your tax base? How do you provide livelihoods for people who are either dependent directly on the industry or indirectly through things like the checks that Alaska mails out to households?
It's pretty tough. I mean, it's pretty tough to see very many successful examples of this. I think, Saudi Arabia is one example of a country trying to affect this, and it's going to take a while. I think some of the smarter people running nation states understand that they've got to make this transition because they do see peak demand coming somewhat close up the road, but it's a difficult thing when you've got, the United States has such a broad, complex economy that it can pump oil and not suffer from what some people call the Dutch disease, which is just sort of you just get so stuck in your entire economy revolves so much around one commodity that you just can't live any other way. Alaska is unique, it feels like, in this because there's not a whole lot else that they can do. But I think they could keep watching places that are trying to divest. Again, Saudi Arabia. Liam may know of other examples. It's a tough transition for them, especially in places that really, really is so dependent on it.
Liam, you mentioned a meeting with Governor Dunleavy of Alaska, and you say that he wants to maximize oil and gas revenue now to sort of pave the way for transition. But have you heard of anything that the state is actually doing in terms of earmarking revenue from oil or any other mechanism that, or because, if you're a cynic, you might think, well, yeah, of course that's what's going to say, and 10 years from now, come talk to me. But did you hear of anything? Have you seen anything that the state is doing to hasten the transition?
I mean, I think rhetorically it's there. I mean, I met the governor at a sustainable energy conference that he had organized in Anchorage, and I would put him in the camp of he's kind of throwing things against the wall to see what might work. Alaska, for various reasons, has very expensive electricity in general, and needs to bring that cost down, and they can certainly use renewables where possible to do that. But it has some some intrinsic problems. A lot of communities are off the grid. They use diesel-fired generators, and shipping diesel around in Alaska is very expensive and obviously not great for the environment either. I think Alaska and the North Slope in general are just starting from a really difficult place because, with the boom that came in the 1970s, obviously it transformed of living in Alaska for a lot of people. I would say particularly for the villages of the North Slope, sense of what it was like, up until the 90s. Gibney, as it's known, which is the capital of the North, was pretty much the only place that had there. The census office was estimating that 4/5 of households there didn't have access to a functioning public sewer system. Once you've had a generation that has become used to living with basic services that frankly in the South we've taken for granted a long time, and which are funded effectively by petroleum taxation, it's very hard to hear people say, well, now you need to change that and get off that. There is no easy alternative for a state like Alaska, and it's partly because living off oil rents and particularly those dividend checks that come out of the Alaskan Permanent Fund create distortions of their own, a form of Dutch disease for a state like Alaska, just as it has done for states like Saudi Arabia. So I think what they are trying to do, but I don't think there are any easy answers, and I think like the energy transition writ large, there's going to have to be a fairly hefty role for the government, including the federal government. They're trying to effectively buy themselves time to figure out what comes next.
Another thing that really struck me about your piece was your discussion of and you talk about this when you describe a meeting with Rahm Emanuel, who was then who's now the U.S. ambassador to Japan and participated in a conference that Don Levy that you attended, and he made the case that really, tapping this oil is a great way to woo Asian customers off of their reliance on Russian energy. But why is that? Why is that case so compelling? What he was talking about transportation costs. What were those? What did those involve?
Yeah, so Rahm Emanuel was, or Ambassador Emanuel was talking specifically about liquefied natural gas. So one thing about the North Slope of Alaska is it has an awful lot of natural gas, but there's been no easy way to monetize it. There's no one up there to buy it. You can't really ship it out because the coast is ice locked for a large part of the year. So there's been this idea kind of floating around for decades about building a sort of Trans-Alaska Pipeline Mark II, but to bring gas down to the south coast, liquefy it, and then send it on ship to Asia. And the advantage of that is that Alaska is strategically located very close to Asia. You can sail a ship from the south coast to Japan in about 9 days, which is a lot less time than it takes from the U.S. Gulf Coast, or even, big gas powers like Qatar in the Middle East. And it's also cheaper to do it that way. Now, you do have to get it down a pipeline, that's going to cost you the best part of $40 billion or so, and a terminal to get it there. But I think in a world where we are shifting perhaps from this idea that energy is, barring the odd crisis, a fairly freely traded commodity, to one where we're kind of reverting back to competing blocks under the pressure of this war in Ukraine, then it perhaps starts to look a bit more attractive. You're willing to pay a bit more as an insurance premium, and in some ways we're kind of coming back full circle to what fueled the Alaskan energy boom in the 1970s in the first place.
Mark, how do you, as someone who is focused on the other side of the question, when you hear about these strategic imperatives, what do you hear? What do you think?
Well, we have to keep in mind that the U.S. is not, the world's biggest fossil fuel burner at the moment, and we have to think about, we live in the planet is changing, and we're only one part of a planet, and we have limited impact on it at this point. China, India, lots of developing countries who, arguably deserve development, deserve higher standards of living, and that takes a lot of energy, as we know, incredible amounts of energy, and it's going to be very difficult to make that transition. And so I think the political transition that we're talking about here, the changing political minds, maintaining, momentum toward solving problems, and having to burn a little bit of oil and gas in the meantime in order to keep people on board, on side while we do that. I think that kind of applies to the world in a way too. We don't want, as we saw, if you have conflict in the world, Russia invading Ukraine, China taking sides, conflict leads to insecurity, which leads to, as Liam was talking about early, people clinging to the things that they know best, which is burning coal as fast as they can. You have this weird thing where, yes, when we had the disruption of COVID, briefly we stopped burning energy for a while. We stopped using energy so much for a while, and the planet breathed a sigh of relief for just a second, but then we got right back to it, and then we went even harder, and then we had the war right after that, and so we've undone whatever good we did with a brief interregnum in economic growth. And so I think it still seems to be the case, and people would argue otherwise, that you need to keep the economy, the global economy, running smoothly, and U.S. supplies of oil and gas seem to be the best bet that we have for that. And so if we can get that stuff to Asia easily and cheaply, that improves our energy security, but maybe also the world's energy security, and does, after several steps, hasten the energy transition and keep us all, holding hands and working together toward a cleaner future. Hopefully.
Well, that you mentioned the magic word "future," and that's been one of the most interesting aspects to me. Is just a long time it's going to take before some of these new projects are going to come to pass. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens with that, whether or not in 2050 we're going to be celebrating the opening or the shutdown of projects like Willow. But in the meantime, I commend to all of you folks out there Liam's great piece. Go to bloomberg.com/opinion. You'll find it. Among the other things that you'll find there, just a fascinating look at what it takes to drill oil when it's 100 below zero, and you're miles, hundreds of miles away from being able to replace parts, and let alone get brand label whiskey. So with that, I bid you all a good afternoon, and thank you, Liam, for a great piece, and thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Mark, as well.
Thanks, James. Thanks,
Thank
Mark.
you.